waiting, waiting, waiting. During this time of lockdown, and as each of the restrictions are being lifted over the coming weeks, we are in a holding pattern and a period of waiting. We might feel very much like the disciples. Listen to today's reading. It's from Acts 1:9, verse 9 through to 26. After Jesus was taken up, as they were watching, and a cloud took him out of their sight. While he was going, they were gazing into heaven, and suddenly 2 men in white clothes stood by them, and they said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up into heaven? This same Jesus who has been taken from you to heaven will come in the same way you've seen him going up." Then they returned to Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey. And when they arrived, they went into a room upstairs. Now, for the next few days, or so many days, they seem to just be in this room, this upper room, waiting and waiting and waiting for the Father's promise, which we saw in the last episode yesterday. And in this section of reading, it seems very, very trivial. Things seem to be very, very ordinary. As Jesus takes off into heaven, they're set there up there looking up into the heavens, waiting to see what happens. And 2 men come to them and say, "Listen, why are you sitting here waiting? Go back to Jerusalem and do what Jesus told you." And you know what Jesus told them to do? He said, "Just wait. Hang around. Keep doing what you're doing. Just wait." Now, in this lockdown, we might feel like there's a lot of things that are just in holding pattern and it's just more of the same and it's waiting and waiting and waiting. But I want to show you just 2 things from this passage that they did while they're waiting. The first is verse 13. When they arrived, they went up into the upper room where they were staying. And verse 14, they were all continually united in prayer. The first thing is that they were waiting on God. They were taking their time to be connected to Him and waiting on Him and asking of Him, depending on Him, dwelling on Him. Perhaps they had moments where they were opening the scriptures and learning from Him and His character. Perhaps they were digging deep, maybe into the promises of God. They're waiting on the promise to come, and maybe they're rehearsing some of the promises of God from the Psalms, or reading about His mighty acts in the Exodus and what God had done for them in the past. Perhaps for you may have a prayer journal, or you might have just a memory of some things that have happened, and you might rehearse some of that, how God has been good to you, what He's done for you, how God has come through with His goodness. Whatever that may be, they're continually united in prayer, meaning they're waiting on Him. They're waiting on Him. There's a spiritual element to it. But the second thing is, they get on with some practical administrative business. The next thing they do, as they're waiting on prayer, is they organise someone to replace Judas. Judas has died, and it says here that we need to get someone in his place. Now, how they go about it? They go about it by casting lots, and Peter gives them a speech as well on who they should pick. But it's something very practical. They get on with just doing what they can and getting something done. So, waiting. 2 things they do. They depend on God. They're continually united in prayer, something spiritual, but they also are something practical. They just get something done that they can do at this moment while they're waiting for the Father to deliver on His promise. But just as we finish, I want to show you what they do. I want you to make note and see that the person they replace Judas with, there's a really important, necessary qualification about who this must be. Did you notice there in verse, or you probably didn't because you haven't read it through, but listen to this, verse 22. Peter says this one must be someone, verses 21 to 23, it must be someone who's accompanied us the whole time the Lord Jesus went out in among us. Must be someone who was there from the beginning of John's baptism until the day Jesus was taken up into heaven. So all the way through His death and through his resurrection. And it must be someone, it says it's necessary, someone who was a witness to the resurrection. So Peter says here, we need to choose someone to replace Judas. It must be someone who has seen all of Jesus' life, heard about what he's done and his teaching, someone who has seen his death, and also a witness, most importantly, a witness to his resurrection. Waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. Let's wait on God and be people who depend on him and ask him. But at the same time, let's be people that are practical and do what we can for God's kingdom whilst we wait on him.